Hello. So let's now talk about the two different kinds of methodologies that we use in advertising research. Okay, so the number one there is qualitative methodology, and number two is quantitative methodology. Within the qualitative methodology, there are many different methods, qualitative methods. And within the quantitative methodology, you have a bunch of quantitative methods. Okay, so in this video, what I'd like to do is focus on qualitative methods. And what I'd like to do is focus on these four techniques. There are more, but we primarily use these four in advertising research: interviews, focus groups, copy testing, and ethnographic techniques. So let's start with the first one, which is interviewing. Okay, so, we all know what an interview is, right? A person sitting, with you, and the two of you are talking. One person's interviewing the other person for a job interview, right? Um, in the same way, we use the method of interviewing while talking with respondents or potential sort of samples, potential people who would be good. Customers for our brand, right? So we reach out to them, we talk to them. Now that could be face to face, it could be an online chat as well, it could be a phone call. That is, we create an interview guide, which is basically a bunch of questions, and then we ask those questions in a systematic, intuitive way to help us understand what this person feels about a brand like ours. Okay, so the first one there is an interviewing method within the qualitative methodology. And of course, there's a lot of training that you need to do to get to a position of being able to interview in the right way, in a sensitive way, right? Um, of course, uh, this person that you see on the screen is a very, very good interviewer. So have a look at how she's asking questions, how sensitive she is. And of course, this particular video is about how to conduct a good interview. So let's look at that.
Hey YouTube, I'm Tony Masilis. I'm a producer here at the CBS Evening News, and I have the pleasure of working with Katie Couric on a very regular basis.
Pleasure.
It's a pleasure. And you're obviously known for your interview skills. So there's this new channel at YouTube called the Reporter Center, and they wanted us to just ask you a few questions about what makes a good interview.
Okay.
So maybe the first question would be, what makes somebody a good interviewer?
Well, I think it's really important, Tony, to be a gracious host, because I think the more comfortable you make someone feel, the better interview you'll ultimately get. So I know that in terms of body language, I always try to be very warm and welcoming. And I think it's really critical to put someone at ease. I think also you have to calibrate your tone depending on what interview you're doing. If I'm talking to David Duke about, anti-Semitism or racism, obviously I'll have a very different tone. I'll be much more pugnacious than I would be when I'm talking to someone who may have suffered a personal tragedy. So I think it's really important to be very empathetic in some cases, and then to know when you're going to be loaded for bear and really try to elicit important information from someone who may be a bit oily and not direct in answering your questions.
How do you prepare for an interview?
Well, I try to do a combination of explaining what I can in the body of the question without going on and on. And I try to ask questions, obviously, that don't require a yes or no answer, because that's a disaster, because you're left kind of with a lot of dead air. And depending on who I'm talking to, I fashion my questions that way. And I sometimes go through them and think, well, how is this person likely to answer this? And what would be an appropriate follow up? And knowing what they've said in previous interviews or their positions on various issues, I think, well, how can I go at this another way? Sometimes it happens spontaneously, obviously, when someone doesn't answer your questions. But at other times, I think you can predict appropriate follow up questions.
It might sound a little bit Captain Obvious, but listening is probably really important, right?
Very, very. Nothing is worse for me than as a viewer to watch someone go down a laundry list of questions and not explore something with a little more depth after someone has answered a question already. To not pick up on something, maybe an inconsistency or something that may be news, and follow up on that and use that as the springboard to go into a whole different area. I think you need to use your questions as sort of a template, but you have to be willing to listen, as you said, Tony, and really veer off in a totally different direction. I can't stand it when people don't have the ability to do that. I'm like, it makes me crazy.
Now, that being said, have you ever had an interview go pretty far south on you where you're sitting there like, what do I do now?
Yeah, well, it is hard. Sometimes people freeze. Sometimes they're just cranky. I had an actor who I interviewed, who shall remain nameless, who just didn't want to be bothered. It really annoyed me because I was giving him a lot of time on national television and he clearly didn't want to be there. But I one member of the Flying Wallendas, I know, why was I interviewing them? This woman answered every question with a monosyllabic answer, and it was very frustrating to kind of get her to elaborate. And then Bobcat Goldthwait, the comedian, I sort of missed the memo that he screamed, so I kept asking him, "Why are you yelling at me?" And I didn't realize stupidly that was part of his shtick. That was
Did you know who he was?
Really embarrassing. I kind of knew a little bit about who he was. Now I certainly know all about him.
Oh, well, I'm sure you do the hard way, right?
Yeah,
you learned
exactly.
about Bobcat.
Exactly.
Any last minute tips that you want to give to people? Anything that anybody starting out in the business might want to know?
Well, I think you should remember who you're serving, your audience. You're trying to inform them. You're trying to illuminate a certain subject, enlighten people. And I think you need to keep that in mind. This isn't a self-aggrandizing exercise about how much you know. It's not an opportunity for a gotcha moment. I think it's really to shed some light on how someone thinks and their position, and to allow them to communicate. And I think if you allow your interview subject to communicate whatever message he or she might have at that moment, then you've done an effective job.
Thank you so much, Katie. It's time for me to get back to the other side.
Okay, so what you see here, of course, she's a journalist, and so she is coming at it from that perspective, but some really great suggestions on how to interview people. And I really do like this clip. Every time I watch it, I'm reminded of what I should do in an interview. Okay, so that is number one, a face-to-face interview, or a phone interview, or an online interview, right? There's also something that we call intercept interviews. Let's say you're in a grocery store or in a mall, and someone walks to you and say, "Hey, I'm conducting a quick survey. Would you like to answer a few questions?" And they tend to have a sheet of paper, and they, a lot of them are yes or no kind of questions. Maybe one could be a little bit more elaborative, and then that's it, right? So, and that is what we call an intercept interview. Okay, so it's a short interview, quick public opinions, and then it's kind of unreliable. It's not scientific at all. But sometimes they just want to gauge very quickly whether you like a product or you don't. Right? There was a point where my bosses at my company asked me to help them choose which logo is good. Is it logo A or logo B, right? And they look kind of similar, but at the CEO level, they had some level of, disagreement. And so I had hired this company to literally go out on the streets on Fifth Avenue in New York City. And, there was a team of a bunch of people, and they were just standing there with two pieces of, the logo design, and asking people, hey, do you like logo A or do you like logo B? And then eventually we came up with, and we did that actually in several cities, and then we came up with some sort of a decision on which logo to pick. Okay, so absolutely, I would say unscientific. It is not reliable. But sometimes, people do that. Companies do that because, somebody in the C-suite, has an issue, and they just have to make everyone happy. So you do see these kinds of, quick answer interviews, which, uh, we call intercept interviews. Okay. Okay, so let's move on to the next kind of qualitative method, which we call focus groups.